It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Matt Zefferman is an assistant professor of defense analysis at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, USA. He is an evolutionary anthropologist who uses ethnographic fieldwork and evolutionary theory to better understand human behavior, especially in the context of human cooperation, conflict, and mental health. His title today is Evolutionary Perspectives on Combat Stress, a comparison of American veterans and Turkana warriors. So over to you, Matt.
All right, so I just wanted to say up front, a lot of the work presented here has been recently published in this paper in Evolutionary Human Behavior and recently in PNAS, and you can find those papers on the website if you're interested in reading more about the details of the work. Right, so in this talk we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, and there is a lot of different ideas about the origins of PTSD. The classic kind of evolutionary psychology, evolutionary medicine work kind of focuses on PTSD as what they sometimes called an overlearned survival response, which is that the different symptoms of PTSD evolved to help people in ancestral environments survive after they've encountered a traumatic experience and help them avoid danger in the future. And kind of I think the work that most explores this is this book by Chris Cantor called Evolution and Post-Traumatic Stress, but there have been other evolutionary psychologists and evolutionary psychiatrists who have explored various aspects of PTSD, and we'll look a little bit at that in today's talk as we go. There's also in cultural anthropology, this idea that PTSD was a collection of symptoms put into a syndrome that was really constructed from kind of the socio-political ideas of the United States, mostly at the end of the Vietnam War. And a lot of the ways that we think about trauma and post-traumatic stress in general would be different if you had created this syndrome at a different time, and it kind of reflected the United States in the post-Vietnam War era. In cultural psychology, there's this kind of similar idea, but they're looking mostly at going to different societies, and instead of kind of assuming a PTSD construct, they're going out and trying to figure out what they call idioms of distress are prominent in different societies, which they contrast to kind of the Western conception of post-traumatic stress disorder. And then, in the popular literature, this is a book by journalist Sebastian Junger that was a bestseller in the United States and called Tribe. And his idea is that combat stress in particular is really something that's unique to industrialized Western societies, or at least societies that lack a kind of tight-knit social environments typical of small-scale societies. So he calls these systems of support that, in other societies, you wouldn't have things like combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder. And so you have all these kind of like seemingly different ideas about PTSD. Is it kind of a universal overlearned survival response that is broader than shared just by humans, or is it something that's really particular to certain societies, specifically industrialized societies? One problem here is that there's not a lot. The argumentation is based on a scenario where you have little to no research in combat stress in small scale, and by that I mean non-industrialized societies. And small scale is I've found a much debated term, but the kind of societies that Sebastian Junger talks about that don't have kind of a Western or at least industrialized military conflict. And so like Sarah Matthew, who's a anthropologist at Arizona State, who is the principal investigator for this project, and I was working on it as a postdoc, she and I decided that we would explore combat stress at her field site, which is in Turkana County in northwest Kenya. Which is, if you look on the map, is this red part here. The kind of stripy bit of the map is where is kind of disputed territory with Kenya and South Sudan, but for all intents and purposes, it's controlled by the Kenyan government. And this area is semi-arid, so you can see some landscapes here. This is kind of the wet season at the top where there's a little bit of water going down in this riverbed, but it's really dry and it's pretty sparsely populated. And it's also interesting because it kind of borders Uganda, South Sudan, and Ethiopia, and has like Turkana here on the right. So it's has kind of these international borders surrounding it. Our field site is in this area here, which is the Lakatipi Plain, and it's about 40 kilometers from the border of South Sudan. The Turkana are a pastoral people, which means that they make their living off of livestock, which they use, which is their store of wealth, but also their source of food and sustenance. They have cows, sheep, goats, camels, and donkeys. And donkeys are used primarily for transport. And camels are a relatively new and fairly rare introduction to this area. So it's mostly cows, sheep, and goats. And you can see it's pretty dry. Here are some women that are watering their livestock. This is a dry riverbed where the water is flowing quite a bit down below the surface, and then they hand dug a well. This well's here for a while until it rains again, but they hand dug the well, and then they can bring water up to the top to water their animals. They're also what we call a semi-nomadic group, which means that they travel from place to place with the rains, wherever the grass is greener, but also to avoid areas where there might be a lot of conflict. So there's this constant decision making about do we migrate to a certain area where there's more grass available for the cows, also where there might be more of members of other ethnic groups who they might get into conflict with. So there's that, but also because they're semi-nomadic, they can and often carry their housing material with them, and at the top are a couple of kind of traditional temporary housing for Turkana that they can move around or leave in place depending on where they're going next. And you can see it here down here, they're using some donkeys to transport the material. So they're what we call a semi-nomadic pastoral group. And our specific field site is here in this area. We moved around a lot to different areas. And the reason I'm putting up here is that there are, you'll see that there are a number of different other pastoral groups that the Turkana border. There's the Dadoths, the Toposa, the Nagatam, and the Murele. There's a few others too, but these are kind of the main ones. And in our group, mostly engages in cattle raiding with the Toposa. And so as I said, cattle is a store of wealth. It's also the way that men can officially marry their wives is by providing a negotiated amount of cattle or other livestock to her family. And one way that young men can get cattle is by going to the areas of other ethnic groups and taking the cattle by force. And I should also say that Turkana are also raided by members of each of these groups. And there are about 1 million Turkana total. About 800,000 are about 200,000 live in towns, and then the rest are these pastoral groups. And so they're a pretty big group, but they don't raid other Turkana generally for cattle. So there's this kind of lethal cattle raids that go across the border into the Toposa, which I said is about 40 kilometers. So they might go like 100 or 120 kilometers round trip by foot, carrying their water with them. There's some water points, but mostly carrying their water with them and carrying whatever firearms they happen to have. A little bit of information about raids. They can be lethal. Firearms began becoming more prominent in the 70s, and now they're ubiquitous for both sides. The firearms are prolific. There's not a lot of ammunition, which is probably good. So, but it's potentially and probably true that firearms increase the lethality of the raids in the last 50 years. They travel over 100 kilometers round trip on these raids. Participation is voluntary. There's no centralized authority that can compel men to go on raids. Men are participating because if they win, they'll get a share of the cattle. But there is informal encouragement from peers and from maybe prominent figures like diviners or important people. But participation is voluntary. Men can refuse to participate if they don't want to go on a raid. There's no formal hierarchical command structure. Often groups will appoint a raid leader who will coordinate the raid and make decisions for the group about strategy or tactics, but there's no kind of coercive command and control structure in the Turkana. Each man is making his own decisions about how and how long to participate. And then any sanctioning is distributed. It's not, there's no decision making from a higher authority. Also, raiding is integral to the livelihood of a lot of Turkana men, and raiding is strongly endorsed by society, which we'll look at a little bit further down in the talk. These raids are do result in a lot of combat exposure. So the average mortality on each raid is about 1%. And this is based on previous work by Sarah Matthew in the area where we did our study. About 50% of adult male mortality is from warfare, and that includes both offensive and defensive raids. About 60% of that is when the Turkana are the group that is doing the raiding, and about 40% are when the Turkana are raided by other groups. And then about 1/5 of all male children that are born die in warfare, and women and children also get killed when Turkana are attacked. And so it's not uncommon for the women and children also to have combat exposure, being on the receiving end of the attacks. And also one thing that, just as an aside, that we are exploring is it turns out that women often are more involved in actually fighting the enemy when the Turkana attack than people had previously realized. So that's something that Sarah and her collaborators are looking into. That kind of came out of this research as a side discovery. So there are, so when we decided to look at combat stress in this group, we went to the DSM-5 and looked at the different 20 different symptoms of PTSD. And we, instead of organizing them like they're organized in the DSM-5, we took a kind of an evolutionary functional approach where we said, both looking at Chris Cantor's book and other literature, like what kind of evolutionary function might some of these symptoms result from. So in Chris Cantor's work and other evolutionary psychiatry books, they kind of have these types of symptoms are pretty well theorized about, which is that you have some symptoms like intrusive memories or nightmares or flashbacks that are thought to be related to learning about a traumatic experience. And the idea is that you might just be exposed to one really extreme traumatic experience, or maybe multiple large ones, and you develop and you have all these mental systems that make this experience more prominent in your head, so that you learn about that experience more and it's more salient to you. And then there is hypervigilance and startle, which they think are reacting symptoms, which are like you are more prepared if this traumatic experience might happen again. And then kind of like in the combat stress literature, this is often seen as dysfunctional, because when you have these symptoms and say you're in a expeditionary military like the United States and you go into combat and you come back, then you are applying potentially these symptoms in scenarios where they're not appropriate or adaptive. Then we looked at these symptoms which we thought were similar to the symptoms of depression. We call these depressive symptoms for that reason. And the idea here is that these symptoms, and we're basing it on this paper on the social risk hypothesis, and there's some other similar hypotheses out there about depression, that depression is a way of avoiding the social risks. So these are more about risks from other people. So you have the physical risks of maybe combat, but then you have the social risks about potentially, and we'll get into this in farther in the talk about the moral and ethical implications of actions. And then we had some symptoms that we considered mixed. Insomnia is like classically, like it's really hard to categorize because it's kind of like depression. It's also maybe similar to hyperarousal. And so insomnia is like one, I think in the literature, people kind of recognize that as a kind of a grab bag symptom. Avoiding reminders is also something that's kind of mixed because you could have avoiding reminders. So for example, we had a participant who avoided a knife that he had gotten in a raid that he had that had been used to kill people, and he kind of threw it away because he didn't want to think about the raid anymore, which doesn't seem that adaptive. But but you also have avoiding people who might remind you of the raid, which seems a little bit more depressive. So we classify that as a mixed. And then you had some that didn't really fall very easily into either of these, though some reviewers have made arguments one way or the other, but we didn't a priori see any good reason to include those in one of the categories or the other. During the review process, we actually discovered some literature that looked at other classifications from the clinical side for depression, for PTSD, and this is also based on like principal component analysis and things, trying to compare it to the DSM classification. And there's some variations on this, but they kind of have classified like all of our learning symptoms as re-experiencing symptoms, and then the reacting symptoms both as hyperarousal, and then they called what we called the depressive symptoms, they called dysphoria. So these are called sometimes dysphoria models of PTSD. And so it was kind of neat to see in the clinical literature, at least some people who were thinking, though not functionally, were thinking categorically along the same lines. And then down below, these things are kind of mixed in the literature with how they were classified, which I won't go into here. It's in our paper. All right, so actually conducting the field work. So we set up camp with a kind of outside of what we call a host family here, and you can see this is kind of more of a permanent settlement because of the size of the structure to our right. And we interviewed people that are kind of passing through the area. We asked every male that we participated who was of rating age to participate, and we had about I think it was a 98% rate of people agreeing to participate. So we had a really high rate of people. And the interviews lasted, I think the shortest was around 40 minutes, and some of them lasted up to 5 or 6 hours, depending on both the combat experience of the person and based on their verbosity. But we also traveled out to more far-flung areas. So this is a Turkana encampment that we drove up to. And this also involved getting both individual buy-in, doing the standard kind of procedure, kind of oral verification that the individuals are willing to participate, but also getting buy-in from the community. So we'd start off with briefing the people about what we're doing, why we're there, what the purpose of the research was, that kind of thing, and getting community buy-in. And over the course of, I did this over 6 months, so 3 sessions of 2 months each. We interviewed 218 warriors, collecting lots of data about combat exposure, their moral beliefs about warfare, their PTSD symptoms, and participation in rituals, which we'll talk about, and things like that. So the pretty extensive interviews. We collected information on tablets here, and we interviewed a wide range of individuals. So an older man like this who might have been decades since he last went on a raid, to younger men who maybe had been returning to or going on a raid within weeks or days of our interview. And we were careful to when subjects recounted their most, I guess the raid that gave them the most problems, that all of those were outside of 6 months of the study. And the first 2-month period, we did a pilot study where we kind of developed our questionnaire. And then by the end, and I did that with one research assistant, then by the end, we had multiple research assistants interviewing participants at a time. So we could have 4 or 5 interviews going at once if we go out to an area. So we could, in one day, if you go out, we could potentially get 8 or 9 interviews accomplished. and we kept everyone spaced apart. All right, so one thing we found, just as a measure of combat exposure for our data, there was a median of 3 battle raids, and battle raids are large-scale raids that involve potentially up to 300 people. So these kind of very large organized raids. You know, the median participant had 3 battle raids, 1 stealth raid, and the stealth raid is maybe groups of 10 or 12 folks that go out and that's kind of at the top end. It could be as little as 3 or 4 that go out, and the idea is that they kind of sneak around and try to steal cattle without being caught, whereas a battle raid is you're almost guaranteed to be engaged in some sort of combat. And then 2 defensive raids, meaning they were involved in 2 raids where the Turkana were raided. There was a median of 4 times being ambushed, mostly on either a battle or stealth raid, or sometimes on a defensive raid often on defensive raid if they're protecting cattle and then they're ambushed. And then 72% of participants reported having killed someone in a raid, and 26 of participants had at least 1 visible bullet wound. And that's a nice measure because then you can see the physical manifestation of the combat exposure. And this is an area where there are no battle medics or anything like that. So these are 26% of bullet wounds in the people who'd survived raids to participate in our study. Okay, and so you have this area that is a smaller scale society, very different style warfare than our industrialized way of doing it. And then the question is, do Turkana warriors have PTSD symptoms? So just based on we used the PCL5, which is a self-assessment for PTSD, translated in Turkana, and I can get into the translation procedures if you're interested, but we had about 28% of the participants had scores above 33, which according to the worksheet is it's not a clinical diagnosis because we're not clinicians, but it's a I can't remember the term for it, but it means that you should probably get clinically checked out. And we also collected descriptions of a subset of our participants of their symptoms just to make sure that our translation was going well, and also just to have a record of them. Here is an example where a participant is talking about enhanced startle, translated in English. He said, "One day I woke up with my gun ready to shoot, thinking that the enemy was creeping up to attack me while I was sleeping." And this is when he is in his, in a safe area in Turkana. Later, I realized it was a camel grazing close to where I was sleeping. Then I put the gun on safe and lowered it down. Some days later, again, I woke up and got scared with a kudakut, which is the sound of a running donkey. Because of that sound, I got up and shot abruptly, pup, thinking enemies were running. Due to bad luck, the bullet destroyed the forelimbs of the running donkey. So this is one participant's description of his startle response. And in the paper, there are a lot of different descriptions of different symptoms. This is just an example. And then here's an example of where you're talking about estrangement, which is we classified as a depressive symptom. He said, I stay away from the traditional dances and stop joining other elders for discussion under the trees. Most of the time, my heart recalled people who were killed by the enemies on the raid. I stayed away from other people, just like an animal. To tell you the truth, I am not from this area. I am from, and he said another part of Turkana. I'm here because my people were killed. So you're the man who left his friends and family because he to get away, and he's actually living with a different group of Turkana than he knew from his raiding days. And so it was good to have those just to make sure that that our understanding and the participants' understanding were similar for the symptoms. But one thing we want to do is it's hard to know if the scales translate. So but what we did do is we just decided to compare how Turkana's symptomology compares to existing data from U.S. service members. And these are treatment-seeking service members, so they had fairly high severity. So what we did is we looked at Turkana warriors and American soldiers with symptom severity over 33. And what worked out well is that they had a really similar mean and standard deviation. And so we could compare, instead of comparing the absolute value of their assessments, we could compare the relative value of how much they had different symptoms. And so here you have on the x-axis, you have American soldier symptom prevalence, which is scoring a 2 out of 5 for each symptom. And then for Turkana warriors, symptom prevalence, this is also scoring a 2 or higher out of 5 for each symptom. And the score is how much has this symptom been bothering you in the last month. And it goes from 0, not at all, or to 5, which is a lot. And so 2 or greater is considered a prevalence. And so when you look at this, in this dotted line here is the 1-1 line. So that's just, if they had the symptoms at the same rate or the same frequency, they'd be along that line. And you can see that up here, our learning and responding symptoms are pretty similar across the board. Insomnia is pretty similar in between the 2 groups. These kind of others are also similar for the most part. But down here, you have a number, but not all, of what we call depressive symptoms that are lower in the Turkana, and one other and one mixed. So you have this kind of line along the right side of the graph that shows that, yeah, relative to other symptoms, Turkana are saying that they have these depressive symptoms at a lower rate than for American combat veterans. So that kind of indicates that there might be just something functionally different about these depressive or dysphoric symptoms than that it's something about Turkana society that might make those less prevalent. And so we did look at predictors of symptom severity in the Turkana, and we looked at different variables. So we looked at some measures of combat exposure, which were based on a factor analysis of different events that could occur in combat. We looked at whether Turkana had gained animals or lost animals on raids. So those are kind of the outcomes of combat. And then we looked at some moral events. So this is events where there was some sort of moral violation, including killing with their Turkana, especially civilians. And then there were measures of whether the Turkana participated in things that could potentially be moral violations. So these are kind of potential moral violations. And there's more details about this in the paper, but they include a measure of the size of their moral sphere, different events where they could have been the perpetrator of an action against an enemy, whether they killed someone in battle, and whether they had reported being socially sanctioned by people in the Turkana. And there's lots of statistical details here I'm not going to go into, but here you can see that we did a large number of regression models. We found that using a information criteria that combat exposure and combat outcomes loaded a lot more on learning and reacting symptoms, with gaining animals negatively loading, which makes sense. And then we found that these kind of moral measures loaded a lot more on the depressive symptoms. So that kind of will fall along with our hypothesis going in that these kind of learning and reactive symptoms were potentially result of physical danger, whereas the depressive symptoms might be more about the social dangers of participating in combat. And so we had, questions. These are more speculation, partly because there aren't a lot of other societies to do a comparative analysis. So we have, we have an idea of how U.S. and industrialized society deal with combat stress and warfare, and we have the Turkana, and so really getting at the causes might take a larger sample of studies. And one thing though, talking to some clinicians, that we found out is that combat trauma is kind of weird, compared to other types of PTSD, like such as from natural disasters or interpersonal violence. It turns out it's like a lot, especially on the depressive symptom side, it's a lot more difficult to treat. At least that's what some of the clinicians that we talked to informally told us that work with veterans than some of the other ones. People don't recover as easily and don't respond to treatment as well, especially for those what we call depressive symptoms. And some of this has been leading into this this kind of emerging literature on what's called moral injury. And I'm kind of running low on time, so I'm just gonna go briefly through some of this. But moral injury is this idea that some of combat stress is related to perpetrating, witnessing, or failing to prevent acts of that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. And this kind of seminal paper in 2009 is where this started, but this literature has just really exploded even since the time we began this study 5 years ago. And this is just a really brief Venn diagram where moral injury has these ideas of alienation, regret, grief, and shame, but it does overlap in symptomology with PTSD and kind of insomnia, depression, in these measures of sadness. You know, we kind of got the idea of looking at moral injury from our studies of the evolution of warfare in general, that the kind of theory about that we wrote about in 2015. And the idea here is that genetic selection should really discourage risky warfare. Individuals take these a lot of risk. They try to take an extra lot of risk, and you know, for rewards that get distributed to the group. So you know, soldiers get or Turkana, if they win, get some share of animals, but the benefits really get distributed to the group. And it's in Sarah's previous work, she found that you know, there's a big, once you're actually engaged with the enemy, there's a huge incentive for individuals to shirk their raiding duties and grab some animals and run instead of engaging directly with the enemy in combat. But if everyone did that, then no one would get in the animals and they would never win. And so it's this collective action dilemma. And that means that genetic selection invents mechanisms that discourage war, or at least fighting in the war, and we might expect mechanisms to be universal. So then we have like culture, and culture can invent social norms that are applicable to how and if war is waged. And these norms, because they're social norms and cultural norms, they can be cross-culturally variable. And in pastoral groups, Sarah and her and Rob Boyd identify that there's a lot of punishment institutions in the Turkana where people who are cowards or shirk in their fighting have social risk because they can be punished. And then Glowacki and Wrangham found that also in a neighboring group, the Negatom, they have institutions of rewards where people who participate are rewarded. So you have this kind of these institutions that are cultural of punishment and rewards. And these have important genetic consequences. If you are socially shunned or sanctioned in your group or punished, then you know, that can have implications to your survival. And so this is what we mean social risk. That's what we're talking about. And I have a few minutes left, but the sanctioning in war, Turkana do sanction war. They sanction for killing other Turkana. And by sanction, I mean like punish or exclude from society, for being cowards, for free riding on the raiding of others, if there's kind of cheating in the way that animals are distributed, or sometimes for violating instructions of the diviner who maybe asked, you know, initiated the raid. The Turkana, we explored their moral beliefs about killing, and here we asked, you know, is it permissible or morally allowable? Which is a tricky word, but if permissible to kill during a raid. You know, most Turkana warriors we talked to said killing adult men and older boys were permissible, but there's a lot more variation in, say, infant girls and small girls and older and the elderly. It was more about, or half and half. Old women were the ones that were least likely to be endorsed as being permissible to kill. But the point here is there's a lot of variation, and we kind of see that as the norms around killing are about not killing are not very strong. And then we asked if people, you know, who they had killed during a raid, and you know, almost all the people who said they had killed someone killed an adult male, and then some subset of those also reported having killed someone from a different group, but those are fairly rare. So even if there are people who think it's wrong to kill non-adult males, there are not many people. And even if people do endorse that it's okay to do that, there are a lot of people who do not. We also found that Turkana have a lot of moral autonomy. So we asked a question here. This is a vignette. It says, Oedipal is the leader of a large raid, and before going the raid, the warriors gathered to discuss the raid, and the raid leader, Ekalele, said, on this raid, let us kill any of the enemy, including the elderly, the women, the small children. And then Awoy disagreed. Actually, neither one of these are raid leaders. And he said, we should kill only the men, but we should not kill the elderly, the women, and the small children. And then said, what should Oedipal decide? And you know, a large number said they should kill only men. A big chunk of people said they should kill all of the enemy. And then 4% said that leave it to each warrior's personal choice. This is based on some actual reports I've had from participants during the pilot, and in every case that I heard about, and then I asked and no one heard about any other case where this has come up, the raid leader always decides this 4%, leave it to each warrior's personal choice. This kind of shows that maybe there's strong opinions about who it's okay to kill and who it's not. And in the end, the leader just says like, hey, we're not gonna come down, make a solid rule. Everyone just goes with their conscience. And then we had some questions about 3 scenarios where a individual, the first 2, the individual kills a elderly woman, and the first time it's the raid leader said not to, and Esicon did not follow the raid leader's decision, and we asked, should anyone punish him? And then 15% said he should be punished, 85% said not. This next one, the same scenario, except it was by accident. It wasn't an intentional killing. 2% said that he should be punished, 97% said he should not, which kind of indicates that if it's accidental, it's more about the culpability of the individual than about the event itself. And then the last case is the flip of it, where Luboin decides not to kill an elderly woman, even though the raid leader decides that they should kill all enemies. And then again, 16% said that he should be punished. It turns out that these 15 and 16 and even the 2% are all the same people. There's like one more down here for some reason, but so it seems like there are 2 small groups of people who think that the main thing is punishing for not following the raid leader's decision. 2% think that killing should be punished either way. Most people think that there should not be any punishment. And the idea here is that punishment here is collective. So you need a large group of basically people of the same age as you to agree that what you did was wrong and to instill punishment. And having 15 or 16% that want to punish you is not enough. It just becomes a fight at that point. You need a larger percentage of people involved in the punishment for it to be even initiated or effective. So there's very little punishment for these type of moral violations or violations of going against the leader. All right, and so my last few minutes, I'm going to say, so one thing that Turkana have is they have signaling institutions. So these are institutions that say like, hey, this killing that you did in warfare is morally acceptable to our society. There are signals like here's a cowhide bracelet from a successful raid that shows the society's approval for fighting in general. And there's a ceremony called a Kenny that shows that for a successful raid. There are also 3 rituals for people who killed in combat. There's Akipor, which is a purification ritual. There's which all men who kill in combat do. There's Nidabus, which is a protection from ghosts, which is often done at the same time as Akipor. But Nidabus is something that can be done in the future. So if we interviewed one man who had been haunted by ghosts 10 times. He's an older man. Every few years he'd start getting haunted again, and then he would get a group together and perform this ritual Nidabus to try to keep the ghost from haunting him. And these are ghosts of people that they've killed in combat. And then Akager, which is ritual scarring, which is here on the right, which are these small scars that men who've killed can get. And Akager is optional. Not everyone does it for various reasons, but it does it's a visual signal to society that you're someone who's killed. And in our interviews, people had really good feelings about people who had gotten Akager scars that had killed in combat. And all these different rituals we think are part there to signal to a warrior that the moral ambiguity of killing, but reassuring them that killing is something that is acceptable, morally acceptable in their society. And the other thing in Turkana that might lower some of these depressive symptoms is that men sit around and they talk a lot, and they talk a lot about warfare and their battle experiences. And everyone in the community, including most, the women and most of the children, have at least been on the receiving end of a raid, and most of the men have been on raids themselves. And so, unlike in American society, where people often go back to combat and come back home and they're talking to their family, and their family doesn't want to hear about all the awful things they saw or did. In the Turkana, it's really commonplace to have those discussions, and it's ubiquitous in just just me sitting around talking, listening to people talk and having it. I don't speak Turkana, but having the RAs translate the discussion to me, even when I'm not leading the discussion, is a big part of what's going on. And so there's this sense of of community and camaraderie and just understanding in the community. So we posit that depressive symptoms, PTSD symptoms, have different evolutionary roots than ones that are more directly related to the trauma, that they depend on culturally specific moral norms. We predict they'd be more cross-culturally variable, and which is backed up by our study at least, and that they may be associated with this evolving concept of mortal injury. And we think that there's due to this social risk where there's some moral ambiguity about what people do in combat, and there are certain systems that Turkana have that make that decrease the social risk, and at least give signals that there's less social risk for having participated in these actions. Yeah, and that's the end of my talk. I just want to thank our research assistants who, without their help and vigilance, this work would not have gotten done at all. And also our various partner organizations and funding organizations for this work, which are at the bottom. And if there is, and on the bottom right, the Strong Star Consortium, who gave us the access to their data of American combat veteran PTSD symptoms. Yeah, so with that, I didn't see any questions come up in the chat, but I think we have a few minutes so I can answer any that you might have.
Thank you very much, Matt. Really interesting study. I can't see any hands raised or any questions in the chat box. Oh, is there a question? All right, that's praise. There's praise in the chat.
Well, I'll take praise.
So yeah, it's so let me ask you one or two questions then, Matt.
Sure.
What's your sense in terms of the functional impairment in the two groups? I know that you didn't make a clinical diagnosis,
right?
But you had scores and things like that. But do we have any indication from your, from the field that you got of the two groups? Is there a difference in the functional impairment of the two groups with regard to their symptoms? Because you can have symptoms, but you may not be functionally impaired.
Right.
What's your sense in that? Is there a difference?
Yeah. So I mean, I didn't do any personal, just as a caveat, any personal work with the Americans. That was data that existed. So we asked questions of the Turkana that we didn't ask of the Americans. So I can't do a direct comparison, but I have read a lot about people's experiences. So my impression, just based on the work, is we did ask about function. Specifically, we asked a large, not everyone, but a large, maybe about 100 of the participants, if they found that these symptoms were good or bad, right? So we were really careful not to say that these were that there was anything wrong with people that had these symptoms, or that it was some sort of, the idea of a mental disorder is not something that is in the air there. So and the most people thought that most symptoms were bad. The only, and however defined, and the only ones that most people thought that there was a subset of people that thought that hypervigilance was on net better than not having hypervigilance. So this is just always, being aware of your surroundings and maybe quick to react. Though some people did recognize that could go poorly in the wrong context. The other one was, there's a symptom that's like, do you try to avoid memories of the traumatic experience? And that one was, a lot of people thought that was a good symptom to have, is to basically trying to forget, which is common in the cross-cultural psychology literature, which is this idea that trying to forget is really important to do, which goes kind of against the clinical literature. And so that's the only one that people at least felt was a good symptom, though there was some support for hypervigilance. As far as how it influenced them, people definitely had stories about men who attacked their family and had to be ostracized and all these things because of their combat experiences. I think there is potentially more acceptance of a lot of these hypervigilance and startle responses. I think that people were just we interviewed a lot of the wives of the men, and I think there was a acknowledgement that this is a fairly common thing, and people kind of have a sense of how to deal with it. So in that sense, maybe there's more social support, and it doesn't impair them as much functionally as it would in the U.S. case, where it's much more of an aberration. So, but I don't have any hard quantitative measures of that. just kind of my impressions from talking to people.
Right, thanks for that. Randy has his hand up.
Hey, Randy.
Randy, go ahead.
So it's fabulous to see how much more data you have about this, and amazing and wonderful to see that you're breaking it down into different symptoms and treating them separately. It's just so admirable and necessary. My question is really similar to Riyadh's, and maybe you've really answered it with as much as you can, but I was curious if you got the general feeling that the Turkana sometimes said, oh yeah, these are kind of useful things. I mean, yeah, except, I mean, I'm just trying to get your personal sense from talking with people about whether they said, yeah, you know, other than the you know, activation and wariness, were they thinking that, yep, this is just what happens and it's not a bad thing, or were they thinking it's a bad thing but it's not a disease, or were they thinking, I wish this wasn't happening to me, there's something wrong with me?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, and I just want to thank Randy, because we had Sarah and I both had some really productive discussions with Randy when we were kind of putting this research together. He was very, very helpful to us. Yeah, I'm glad that you're happy with the data that we ended up getting. Yeah, so yeah, it is kind of that question is a little bit tricky in the sense that it's, you know, the people there didn't necessarily see these as all like combined in one thing. And actually, there were a number of people who expressed surprise to us about, well, you know, how does this white man know to ask all these interesting questions? And so I think that you know, kind of putting these all together as a group of because we started off saying like, here's a list of things that sometimes happen to people. You know, does it happen to you? And I think that, you know, that people were surprised that you know, it wasn't necessarily like these people had thought about it together. One thing that I also thought was interesting is when we just kind of asked more open-ended questions about like what happens when people have a really stressful or traumatic raid, you know, trying to get at things that may be outside of the DSM, which is more of the kind of the cultural psychology approach to this type of question, is ask people on their own terms what happens. There was a lot of, I don't know if conflation is the right word, but there's a lot of discussion of, you know, physical things like people would weaken or shrivel away. This is also, if people don't do this, this Acapor purification ritual, people say happens to them is that they physically weaken, they can't eat, you know, they, even if they do eat, they wither away is kind of the best way to say it. They kind of lose body mass and things. And there was not a huge distinction between these kind of physical, what I consider physical reactions, and what we could call mental reactions. And, you know, and as far as like, did people think they were good overall? I think there was a lot of like, this is kind of what happens. So, and I think asking whether it was good or bad seemed kind of a weird question to them. Though, you know, like I said to Adam, I think that, or Riyadh, I'm not sure who asked, that there is the sense that, you know, maybe some of these hypervigilance things are net good. Like they're bad kind of in general, but they can come in handy. You know, if you are sleeping and you do get, if you're in an area where the Turkana are about, that they could come in handy. You know, unfortunately, it's really hard to get, you know, you'd like to be able to say like, well, you know, what are the life outcomes of people with the symptoms without, and it's really hard. We don't have that data, you know, so you could back up kind of people's subjective assessments with the data. And of course, in this literature, you know, you don't have data from people who didn't survive the raid or who were so ostracized from society that we couldn't find them and that kind of thing. So we do worry about that kind of sampling bias too, where, you know, maybe the people that we do get in, and this is true in the clinical literature too, that people you do get in the study are, at least for us, are the people who are at least around and you're able to get to, or in the clinical literature, they worry about the people who are either too well or not well enough. So I don't know if that answered your question, but, you know, those were all, you know, I hope that's what I said was at least related to your question.
Yeah, Adam, go ahead. Ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, just, I guess, a follow-up. I'm wondering whether the individuals who were experiencing these symptoms choose not to go on raids because of it, like, because obviously there's this moral norm.
Yeah.
It's not stipulated that you have to, but, you know, there's obviously, like, you know, peer pressure that the young men get together, and I would advise anyone listening to read your paper, because I think that some of the accounts you have of how it works, of how these these young men kind of go from camp to camp and trying to gather enough people for a raid. It's really interesting, and you can kind of imagine that happening. And I'm wondering whether, yeah, maybe on the one hand, do the PTSD symptoms, force people or make people less inclined to try again, and then also, if they have the symptoms and people know about them, whether they're somehow less morally culpable. So if you know that this individual has been kind of waking up in the night, or the young man who, well, I actually don't know if he's a young man or not, but who shot the legs off the donkey, is he less likely to be forced by others? So is there kind of a protective element there? I don't know if you have any idea of that.
Yeah, I don't know the specifics of that. I mean, we did ask a lot of questions about, like, have you decided to stop rating, and why. I don't know this idea about moral culpability, like if someone is experiencing these symptoms, whether they have different standards or expectations, and I just don't know, because we didn't ask that, but that'd be a really interesting to look at. As far as, like, I had asked why people, if people retired from rating, and that's really, a lot of it's based on age. So if we look at the data, age predicts most of that. Like, older people don't rate as much as younger people. And you ask why people have stopped rating, I don't recall anyone, at least in the data, and I'd have to look, that said, like, hey, I'm just really, having problems, mentally, or having these symptoms or anything. It was mostly, I stopped rating. Some people rate it's like, all my brothers have died and I can't, and I stopped rating because all my brothers died, and, like, maybe my parents told me not to, or whatever else. And there's kind of, if your brothers die, there's things like, you're the one that's inheriting, that's going to carry on your family's, you carry on your family. And also, if you have fewer male relatives, then you have more of your family's animals are yours and your responsibility, and you have to take care of them, but also you have that wealth. And so it gets, these decisions about whether to continue rating or not, mostly were, I guess, long story short, were mostly, what people had said was more about kind of the economic reasons to rate or not. There were a few people who were really into revenge, and a few people who really just enjoyed rating. And I don't have a sense of one way or the other, and because I haven't looked, about how that corresponds to PTSD symptomology, which would be interesting to look at in regard to your question.
Psychopaths. That's the psychopaths.
Yeah, well,
there's
psychopath. I mean, there's that. I mean, so there's this idea of, there's people who just are, there's, like, people that are somewhat motivated by revenge, and that's pretty rare. There are people who like the thrill rating, and you'll see this a lot in the clinical literature with American combat veterans. And sometimes people with PTSD, they come back, they're feeling really depressed, PTSD is really bothering them, and they just re-enlist, and they keep on re-enlisting, and they take every chance they get to get in combat, because it's how they cope with it. And I don't understand it as someone who doesn't have PTSD, but I know people like that, that I've met, who, it's anecdotal, but it's in the literature too, where, they feel best when they're in that high trauma environment, which might have interesting evolutionary implications. I don't know. So I don't know. I don't want to say they're sociopaths because they like rating, and some people just like the camaraderie and everything of rating too. So I don't know. It's a big mess, and I don't have a really straight answer for you, but I think there might be some things in our data, at least anecdotally, that we could look at to get at that.
So our last question, Matt, is from the chat box by Anastasia, and it's a comment and a question. If we can have a brief answer or a brief response to that. It says, I just wanted to point out that this is a good example of the fact that clinical diagnostic manuals don't really apply to everyone. It is important to study mental health issues in non-Western societies so that we can better understand their needs. I think your research is very useful. Please excuse my English. Congratulations on your hard work. So,
that English is great. Yeah, no, I think that's important. And we're not the first ones to obviously go out and look at non-Western, non-industrial societies. I mean, maybe in the context of combat stress and small-scale societies, but they're, the cultural psychologists, which I don't think that, personally, reading some of the evolutionary literature, I don't think there's as much attention paid to what the anthropologists and cultural psychologists are doing as there potentially could be. And they take a different approach. But I think that the amount of variation that they find in the way that different people from different societies respond to, for example, traumatic experiences is really important and really useful to think about from an evolutionary context, because evolution is a large extent not just about selection, but also about variation and understanding where the variation comes from, and how it affects, even if it's cultural variation, how it affects genetic evolution is super important. So yeah, I guess I'm agreeing with your comment and saying that like more people should do work like this. Yeah, thanks.
Great. I think I can't see any other hands, and we're on the top of the hour. So
All right.
Thank you
Thanks.
very much indeed, Matt.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. If anyone wants to follow up with me, yeah, I think you can find me on the web.
Do you want to put your email in the chat
Yeah,
box, Matt?
I'll put my. And I'm also, I think my wife and I, and now our daughter, are the only Zeffermans in the world. So if you just look up Zefferman, you'll find one of us, and I'm the the one with the beard. So
okay,
there's the there's my email.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And excellent, excellent presentation, and a really good start to our webinar series. So
I'm looking forward to the rest of it.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you very much indeed, and over and out.